Next, let's welcome Eduardo Rosario. I still call him Eddie, but he's in New York now, but he used to work with us here in New Jersey on issues like single-payer health care. But Eduardo Rosario is from the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, New York City chapter, and National Jobs for All Coalition Continuations Committee. Welcome.
Good evening, my brothers and sisters. All my friends call me Eddie, so I consider you all my friends, so call me Eddie. I was an amazing, some amazing words from my brother just before, Brother Ham there, and never got to meet you before, so I feel really honored to have finally met you, and we'll sit down and talk some more. It'll be a beautiful thing. But today, I'm here to talk to you about immigration reform. True immigration reform is a component of a shared prosperity, an agenda that focuses on improving the quality of life and the elimination of wage disparity for most of the vulnerable workers and communities, strengthening labor standards, especially the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively, and providing social safety nets and high quality lifelong education and training for all workers and their families regardless of status. To achieve this goal, immigration reform must fully protect all workers and not be used as an instrument of divisiveness used to embolden those who continue to function with impunity and promote the agenda of exploitation upon those communities in need, namely immigrant communities. The most effective way to attain true immigration reform is for all workers, immigrant and native-born, to have full and complete access to the protection of labor, health and safety, and all laws of civil and human rights. Comprehensive immigration reform must complement a well-resourced and effective labor standard with an enforcement initiative that prioritizes workers' rights and workplace protections regardless of status. This approach will ensure that immigration does not depress wages and working conditions or encourage marginal low-wage industries that depend heavily on substandard wages and benefits and working conditions. Unfortunately, the proposed current legislation on immigration reform opens the door for policies and practices that are ruinous, not just for the immigrant worker, but also for the U.S. working class as a whole. The current proposal on immigration reform contains draconian measures that are not without purpose or motive to undermine any hope of unity amongst the U.S. working class and trade union movement with the immigrant community. So let us not be fooled, for it is precisely the purpose of the proposed legislation on immigration reform to keep us divided in order to get us that much closer to return back to the days of barbarism. I'd like to share a little story with you. Actually, it's a true story because it involves my father. Back in the 1940s, my father immigrated to this country from Puerto Rico. That was the same time in this country there was the Bracero program that was going on in west of the Mississippi pretty much, but these were all guest worker programs. And many Puerto Ricans of the time, because of the economic impositions from this country, had to leave their home. They didn't want to leave their home, just as many immigrants don't want to leave their home today. But my father did, like many of his family members did, and his community did. And he answered the call that the U.S. State Department had back in the day, that there were these great job opportunities. And what my father did, the job opportunity, was that he picked tomatoes. He was a migrant farm worker picking tomatoes from the state of Florida to the great state of New Jersey that we're in, and back and forth, up and down the state, just chasing the harvest. Until one day, he was able to escape to New York City that is. And that's when he met my mother, who also left Puerto Rico in the hope of a better opportunity. But when they met each other, my mother was homeless at the time. Just as many immigrants that come to this country, they cross paths and meet each other in many of the same ways and under the same circumstances, hoping for a better life. But unfortunately, regardless of what one may have to endure, it doesn't amount to much, unfortunately, in the eyes of many people, because they're viewed as second-class citizens. And if we as a trade union movement cannot stand for the immigrant worker, then how can we stand for any worker? Amen. So the rights of immigrant workers cannot be divorced from the right to organize, the right to union membership, or the right for the freedom of assembly, just to name a few of these rights. The future and strength of the U.S. labor movement is housed within the immigrant community, whether they like it or not. This is a nation of immigrants that was built by immigrants and African slaves for going back over the past 400 to 500 years. It is here we see how racism has been embedded in the culture of the United States, for all attacks against immigration reform are rooted in fear and misinformation. The North American Free Trade Agreement, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and all other similar free trade agreements, structural adjustment programs, austerity measures and policies, and other so-called economic reforms advanced by the global capitalist class continue to boost corporate profits while creating massive poverty in countries like Mexico and El Salvador and others. And that as a result, millions of workers and farmers are displaced and have no alternative but to migrate in search of work, and therefore will come to the United States to work and join our unions and participate in our organizing drives. The failures and contradictions of the neoliberal theory cannot be solved with guns and soldiers and fences at our borders. They must be addressed through an economic strategy for shared prosperity, along with the proposition of inclusion of all labor rights, human rights, and civil liberties. It is the potential racial profiling and abuses of the reasonable suspicion clause and ID checks that make laws like secure communities and stop and frisk unconscionable and repugnant. It's not too hard to guess who will be asked to provide their papers. And I'll tell you right now, they look like some of us here that are participating in this conference. If Americans are regularly stopped and asked to prove their legal status, then America feels less like America than many purport it to be. Such repressive legislation paves the way for an America that can resemble more like Nazi Germany, when Jews were identified by being forced to wear yellow stars. Our labor movement has called for basic reform of our immigration laws and adopted a position at the AFL-CIO convention in 1999 that demands the repeal of employer sanctions, immediate amnesty for all undocumented workers, protection of the right to organize for all workers, the strengthening of their family reunification as the basis of immigration policy, and opposition to guest worker programs. We must reject all the proposals and legislation in Congress that promote the firing of undocumented workers. Reject all proposals and legislation that open the door to new guest worker programs and do not contain a program for the quick and inclusive legalization of undocumented workers. We must support only those proposals and legislation for immigration reform that would force the renegotiation of NAFTA, CAFTA, and all other free trade agreements in order to stop the enforced poverty that displaces communities abroad, and will oppose any new trade agreements that cause such displacement. This is the response global capital and government officials in the service of the global capitalist class fear the most. But it is precisely the response that we must have, not just as a U.S. labor movement, but as a global labor movement. Thank you very much.